Picture Rome, not as broken stones admired by tourists today, but as it once truly was. Massive, vibrant, and full of energy. A powerful empire where emperors made decisions that shaped the lives of millions, where armies marched across continents, and where much of the known world turned according to Roman orders. Now, think of that same Rome in ruins, looted, weakened, and silenced by destruction. Rome's downfall was not one sudden disaster. It was a long, gradual decline, fueled by poor leadership, internal betrayal, and outside threats that were ignored for too long. In this video, we will trace that decline step by step. We will also uncover the reality of the so-called barbarians, who were not the true cause but rather the closing chapter of a story that had been weakening for centuries. Because every ruin begins somewhere, and Rome's decline started when the empire was at its strongest. In the 1st century AD, Rome looked unstoppable. Under emperors such as Augustus, Vespasian, and Trajan, the empire expanded to its greatest size. From the forests of Britannia to the deserts of Arabia, from the Rhine River to the center of Mesopotamia, Rome stretched across nearly 5 million square kilometers, ruling over more than 60 million people. At that time, about 1 out of every 4 people alive lived under Roman authority. This era is remembered as the Pax Romana, a period of around 2 centuries of relative peace. Roman roads extended for thousands of kilometers. Aqueducts brought clean water into dry areas. Shared systems of law, currency, language, and architecture created a sense of unity. Roman legions maintained order, and trade thrived. On the surface, everything appeared strong and well organized. But beneath this display of power, cracks were already forming. The empire had simply grown too large. Every new province demanded more soldiers, more officials, and more resources than the empire could easily provide. Rome's economy rested heavily on huge estates run by slave labor. But once the empire stopped expanding, the flow of new slaves slowed down, and this system began to weaken. Rome had been built on constant warfare, but when the conquests ended, the very machine that had kept the empire strong began to work against itself. Taxes rose sharply. Ordinary citizens fell deeper into poverty. Year after year, the expenses of running the empire grew larger than the income it could bring in. By the 2nd century, Rome was facing a hidden famine, not of food, but of money, the very lifeblood of the economy. Trade networks that once carried goods from India, Africa, and Northern Europe started to collapse. Ongoing wars, piracy on the seas, and political instability made travel dangerous and trade costly. Without steady tribute from faraway provinces, and with no new lands left to conquer, the empire slid into a financial crisis. To keep paying for armies and public works, the government began to weaken its own currency. Coins contained less gold and silver and more cheap metals like copper. This led to heavy inflation. Prices shot up. A sack of grain could cost twice as much within only a few weeks. People lost faith in money itself. The crushing tax burden fell hardest on small farmers, artisans, and landowners. Many could no longer keep their property, while others simply abandoned their land. Out of this despair, a new system started to form. Seeking protection, thousands of ordinary people turned to wealthy landowners. They offered their labor in exchange for shelter, protection not only from tax collectors, but also from soldiers and bandits. This new model of dependence, where peasants worked for safety under powerful landlords, became the early foundation of what would later evolve into feudalism. Its beginnings can be traced right here, in the breakdown of an empire that could no longer guarantee justice, security, or even survival. Rome's economic collapse didn't just weaken the empire, it also gave birth to a completely new way of life, created out of fear and desperation. While Rome's economy was collapsing quietly, its politics were in complete turmoil. Beginning in 235 AD, the empire entered what historians later called the military anarchy. Over just 49 years, more than 20 emperors rose to power, most of them murdered, overthrown, or killed in battle. No ruler lasted long. No throne was secure. Generals were declared emperors by their own soldiers, and wars were no longer fought against outside enemies. Instead, they became civil wars. Roman legions fought each other. Province turned against province. Unity dissolved as different regions tried to seize power for themselves. With the armies distracted by internal struggles, Rome's frontiers were left vulnerable. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine, the Sarmatians invaded Pannonia, and raiding groups destroyed entire regions. Cities stood unprotected, and people lived in fear, not only of foreign invaders but also of their own soldiers, who plundered Roman towns and estates as if they were enemy lands. The historian Zosimus described this period as a time when Rome seemed to be consuming itself. And he wasn't exaggerating. Imperial authority no longer carried respect. Instead, it was treated like a prize to be fought over. Power was no longer a guarantee of order. It became the reward of war. To survive, Rome had to change. The first major attempt at reform came with a bold step. The empire was split in two. In 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian introduced the Tetrarchy, a new system of government led by 4 rulers, 2 senior emperors called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors called Caesars. Each one was responsible for a part of the empire. In reality, this meant Rome no longer functioned as a single empire. It became 2 separate worlds, East and West. The idea behind the division was practical. Each half could deal with its own problems, using its own armies and capitals. While this solution worked for a while, it also created a division that would never fully disappear. The Eastern Empire, with great cities like Antioch, Nicomedia, and later Constantinople, was far stronger economically. It had rich trade routes, fortified urban centers, and borders that were easier to defend. The Western Empire was very different. Its capital shifted between Milan and Ravenna, and it constantly faced invasions, poor harvests, population decline, and an army that never had enough funding. While the East managed to strengthen its authority, the West steadily lost control. Even Rome itself, though still important as a symbol, was no longer the true center of imperial power. And it was in this weakened Western Empire that outside groups, the so-called barbarians, found their opportunity. But who were these barbarians, really? For the Romans, the word was just a label. It meant anyone beyond the Greco-Roman world, anyone who spoke unfamiliar languages or lived by customs different from Roman law. Yet this description was misleading. The groups Rome called barbarians were not one people, nor were they uncivilized hordes without culture. They were diverse, each with their own traditions, beliefs, alliances, and strategies. Among them were the Goths, divided into the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, semi-nomadic Germanic peoples who had already served Rome for decades as military allies. There were also the Vandals, who crossed Gaul and Hispania before establishing themselves in North Africa, where they built a powerful navy. The Saxons and Franks expanded along the Rhine frontier, while the most feared of all were the Huns, coming from the steppes of Central Asia. Fast-moving, violent, and unpredictable. But it's important to note, these groups didn't always aim to destroy Rome. Many of them wanted to join it. They sought land, protection, and recognition. Some were even welcomed as allies, given official ranks such as dukes, and placed in military or administrative positions inside the empire. Still, real cooperation was rare. Rome's arrogance made genuine partnership nearly impossible. Even when outsiders were granted roles or privileges, they were often treated with suspicion, disdain, and betrayal. That fragile balance between Rome and the outsiders could not last. Before long, the same peoples who once stood at Rome's gates began forcing their way through. And these so-called barbarian invasions were not sudden or random raids. They were part of something much bigger and more complex. These were not just wars, they were migrations. Entire communities were on the move. Tribes, clans, families, women, and children. They were fleeing dangers that Rome could neither control nor fully understand. The first major trigger came from outside the empire. The arrival of the Huns, fierce nomadic horsemen from the Eurasian steppes. Known for their speed and brutality, the Huns struck terror into the tribes living near the Danube. Their advance forced the Visigoths, Vandals, and other groups to flee in massive numbers, many seeking safety inside Roman territory. But there were also internal pressures. Many homelands lacked fertile land, and growing populations pushed tribes to search for new opportunities. Even as it declined, Rome still symbolized stability, wealth, and hope. For many groups, entering Roman territory was not about conquest, but survival, and a chance to build a better future. The problem was that Rome no longer had the capacity to absorb them. Its borders were weak, its administration corrupt, and its resources stretched thin. Efforts at peaceful integration often collapsed, undermined by poor planning, dishonesty, or outright prejudice. What might have been cooperation instead turned into conflict. The migrations snowballed. One tribe pushed into another, which in turn displaced the next, setting entire regions into motion. Some groups arrived looking for peace while others came to plunder. But the empire, unstable and overstretched, lacked the strength to deal with either. For centuries, Rome had successfully turned outsiders into allies. Many were accepted as foederati, whole peoples allowed to settle inside the empire in return for providing military service. In practice, this meant thousands of Germanic, Allan, Vandal, and Gothic soldiers fought under Roman banners, guarding borders, patrolling roads, and battling common enemies. Some even rose to high ranks. Leaders were granted titles such as dux or comes, placed in charge of entire provinces, and in some cases even married into the Roman elite. On the surface, it looked like a working alliance, but beneath it all, tension and mistrust were constant. To the Romans, these outsiders were never equals. Even when Rome depended on them, they were treated with suspicion, insult, and contempt. Promises of land and supplies were often broken. Officials demanded bribes. Food was withheld. Abuse was common. This pattern of mistreatment slowly pushed allies into becoming enemies. By 378 AD, the situation finally boiled over. At the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths, who had been mistreated by Roman officials while seeking refuge, rose in open revolt. Emperor Valens marched out to meet them, confident but completely unprepared. The result was catastrophic. Valens himself was killed in the fighting, and nearly two-thirds of his army was destroyed. This was not just a battlefield loss. It was a turning point. It showed that the so-called barbarians were no longer on the sidelines of history. They had become a decisive force in shaping Rome's fate. As the Goths secured their place in history, an even greater danger was emerging, a threat whose name would terrify the empire for generations. Attila. While Rome was still struggling with Goths and Vandals, a new power rose from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns. They seemed almost otherworldly. Mounted on small but fast horses, armed with powerful composite bows that could pierce armor from a distance, they fought with such ferocity that even Rome's toughest veterans were shaken. But the true age of terror began in 434 AD when Attila took command. Attila did more than command an army. He united scattered tribes, enforced discipline among nomadic warriors, and turned the Huns into a power that stretched across continents. He was not only a warlord, but also a skilled political leader, a shrewd negotiator, and a ruthless strategist. When diplomacy worked in his favor, he dealt with Rome. When it didn't, he burned cities to the ground. Under his leadership, the Huns invaded the Balkans, threatened Constantinople, demanded crushing tributes, and devastated lands from the Danube to the Black Sea. When Attila turned his focus west, chaos spread everywhere. Roman writers were so overwhelmed by the destruction that they gave him a new title, Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. Not because of faith, but because they could not think of any other explanation for the devastation he left behind. But Attila's greatest campaign was still ahead. In 451 AD, he launched his boldest move yet, the invasion of Gaul. This was no ordinary raid. It was a direct attempt to break the backbone of the Western Roman Empire. City after city fell, panic spread, and Rome seemed close to collapse. Then, against all odds, a rare alliance came together. Flavius Aetius, one of Rome's last brilliant generals, gathered a coalition that included Roman troops, the Visigoths under Theodoric the Firster, and other federated allies. The stage was set for a decisive clash. The battle took place on the Catalonian Plains, one of the deadliest conflicts of late antiquity. In the fighting, Theodoric was killed, but Attila was stopped and forced to retreat with part of his army. Rome had survived, but just barely. The relief didn't last. In 452 AD, Attila returned, this time invading Italy itself. Cities such as Aquileia were completely destroyed, and the entire peninsula was thrown into chaos. Rome once again stood on the edge of disaster. And then something unexpected happened. Pope Leo III personally met with Attila. No one knows for sure what was said. Some believe there was divine intervention. Others think Attila was bribed, or that famine and disease made further conquest impossible. Whatever the reason, Attila withdrew. Rome was spared yet again. But the empire's troubles weren't over. Just 2 years later, Attila died, and the Hun Empire quickly splintered. Still, the damage had already been done. Rome may have stood, physically, but in spirit, it was already staggering. And the truth is, even before Attila appeared at its gates, the unthinkable had already taken place. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The Eternal City, untouched by foreign enemies for nearly 8 centuries, fell. But the one who brought it down was not some distant invader. It was a former ally, Alaric, king of the Visigoths. For years, Alaric had served Rome. He fought as a general, negotiated as a diplomat, and demanded fair payment for his people. But time after time, he was ignored, deceived, and humiliated. Eventually, he understood what Rome's rulers refused to admit. The empire no longer kept its promises. So Alaric made a fateful choice. He marched on Rome itself. By then, the city was no longer the empire's administrative capital. But symbolically, it was still the heart of Roman civilization. When its gates finally opened, there was little resistance. For 3 days, the Visigoths plundered temples, villas, storehouses, and monuments. There was no mass slaughter, no complete destruction. Yet the psychological impact was enormous. The world watched in disbelief. To many, this wasn't just a sack of a city. It was the end of an age. St. Jerome, writing in despair, declared, "The world is collapsing." Alaric hadn't reduced Rome to ashes, but he had shattered its greatest weapon, its myth of invincibility. And once that illusion was gone, the empire would never again command the same awe. If the Visigoths had proven that Rome could fall, the Vandals would show, just a few decades later, that it could be plundered again, this time with ruthless precision. In 455 AD, 45 years after Alaric's sack, Genseric, king of the Vandals, sailed across the Mediterranean with a powerful fleet. Landing on the Italian coast, he advanced straight toward Rome. Rome was once again defenseless. Its army had all but vanished, Its government was paralyzed, and its emperor had been assassinated just days earlier, leaving a dangerous vacuum of power. When Genseric and his Vandals marched in, there was no resistance. For 14 days, Rome endured a plundering unlike anything in its history. Unlike the Visigoths, who had looted in frustration and haste, the Vandals came with precision. They knew exactly what they wanted: gold, silver, jewels, sacred relics, even the treasures of the Temple of Jerusalem, brought to Rome centuries earlier by Titus. Nothing was spared. Statues, wealth, and priceless artifacts were stripped away. Genseric also took high-value hostages, including the widowed Empress Licinia Eudoxia and her daughters, trophies both political and symbolic. Once again, Rome was spared from outright destruction, but it emerged hollow, a city drained of its wealth, its dignity, and its symbolic power. The event was so traumatic that centuries later, the very word Vandal would come to mean mindless, destructive violence. Ironically, Genseric's sack had been carefully calculated, but history remembered it as savagery. And perhaps the most symbolic detail of all, by that time, Rome was no longer the empire's capital. The imperial throne had moved to Ravenna, yet Rome still remained the empire's soul. And now, that soul was empty. By 475 AD, the Western Empire had been reduced to little more than a shadow. A teenager was placed on the throne, Romulus Augustulus. His very name carried echoes of Rome's glorious past. Romulus, the city's mythical founder, and Augustus, the first emperor. But this boy would found nothing. Instead, he would become the final symbol of Rome's decline. Romulus had been installed by his father, the Roman Germanic general Orestes. But he ruled in name only, a powerless figurehead governing from Ravenna, with no real army, no control over vast lands, and little respect even within Italy. The end came swiftly. In 476 AD, Odoacer, a commander of barbarian troops serving Rome, demanded land in Italy for his men. When Orestes refused, Odoacer marched on Ravenna, crushed the imperial forces, and deposed Romulus without bloodshed. The last emperor of the West was sent into quiet exile, and with him, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. The boy's life was spared. Given a modest pension, Romulus Augustulus faded quietly into obscurity, never to shape history again. But what followed was something the world had never seen before. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer needed its own emperor. The throne was left empty, and it would remain that way forever. There was no epic final battle, no glorious last defense. The greatest empire in the history of the West ended not with fire and fury, but with silence. It collapsed from within, undone by decades of arrogance, corruption, and neglect. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire had officially fallen. Yet Rome's fall was not just an ending. It was also a beginning. The collapse of the West did not erase Roman culture or its influence. In fact, it spread further than ever. Roman law, language, architecture, and religion endured. They were absorbed, reshaped, and carried forward by the new kingdoms that rose from the empire's ruins. In the East, the Byzantine Empire would survive for nearly 1,000 more years. In the West, fragments of Rome lived on in surprising ways. Cathedrals, built with columns from pagan temples. Germanic kings adopting Roman titles. Monks carefully copying the works of classical authors. The medieval world that emerged was different. Rural, fragmented, and unstable. Yet beneath it all, Rome's spirit remained. Every written law, every word of vulgar Latin that would evolve into the Romance languages, every vision of imperial power carried Rome's memory forward. The empire was gone, but its voice still whispered through the centuries. If this video gave you a new perspective on how empires truly fall and how they continue to live on in other forms, Make sure to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us, what moment do you believe truly marked the end of Rome?